In June of 1979, a stranger walked into the office of the Elbert Granite Finishing Company in Elbert County, Georgia, and asked to speak with the man in charge. The man in charge was Joe H. Fendley Sr., president of the company, a man who had spent his life around granite, who knew the quarries and the cutting sheds, and the ordinary business of tombstones and building stone that kept the town running. The stranger gave his name as Mr. Christian. He said he represented a small group of Americans, people who wished to remain unknown forever, and that this group wanted to build a monument, not a monument to a person, not a monument to a war or a founding, a monument that would carry instructions. Instructions for the survivors of some future catastrophe written in the stone itself, meant to outlast the society that built it. Fendley later admitted he thought the man might be unstable, or joking, or simply unable to pay for what he was describing. He was wrong on all counts. Within a year, on a hillside 7 miles north of Elberton, 4 19-foot slabs of blue granite would rise out of a cow pasture, inscribed in 8 languages, aligned to the sun and the stars, financed in full, and dedicated in a public ceremony, attended by hundreds of people who still did not know who had paid for it. 42 years later, in the dark hours before dawn, someone would end it with an explosive device and walk away clean. No name, no confession, no answer. This is the story of the Georgia Guidestones, and it is not a legend passed down through unnamed families or dug out of the ground by a farmer whose name nobody can confirm. It is a story on the record. It has a granite company with a business ledger. It has a bank president who took a promise to his grave. It has state investigators who worked the case for years and, as of this telling, have made no arrest. The mystery here does not need embellishment because it has never been solved. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The stranger's real name has never been confirmed publicly. What is confirmed is the pseudonym he chose, R.C. Christian, and his own explanation for it, which he gave more than once. He said he had taken the name Christian because he was one, and because the values behind the monument reflected his beliefs and the beliefs of the group funding it. Fendley did not handle the money. That task went to a second man in Elberton, Wyatt C. Martin, president of the Granite City Bank, who agreed to serve as an intermediary. Christian needed someone local who could receive funds, manage an escrow account, and keep his identity locked away from the public record. Martin accepted the role, and in doing so became the only person in Elberton, and quite possibly the only person anywhere, who was ever told who R.C. Christian actually was. He kept that secret for more than 4 decades. In 2010, in a rare interview, Martin said plainly that when he was dead and gone, nobody would ever know who put the monument there. He meant it as a statement of fact, not bravado. Martin explained that Christian had chosen Georgia specifically, citing the region's excellent granite, its mild climate suited to outdoor construction, and a personal connection through a great-grandmother who had been a native Georgian, a detail that suggested Christian's ties to the state ran deeper than simple convenience. Christian communicated with Martin by letter and by telephone for years during the planning and construction, and Martin later recalled that the letters arrived from different parts of the country almost every time, never postmarked twice from the same place, and that Christian often called from airport lounges between flights. The 2 men dined together on occasion. Their contact continued for years after the stones were finished, and by Martin's account it did not stop until just before the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, after which the correspondence quietly ended. Martin died in 2021 at the age of 91. He took the name to his grave, exactly as he said he would. What Christian wanted built was not modest. Site selection alone took months, in part because Christian was specific about what he did not want. No highway frontage, no proximity to town, nothing that would turn the monument into a roadside curiosity before it had a chance to be understood on its own terms, an ambition that history would later treat with some irony, given exactly what the monument eventually became. He told Martin he wanted the monument placed somewhere remote, away from crowds and tourism, on high ground. The location settled on was a 5-acre plot on one of the highest points in Elbert County, land that the group purchased and then deeded over to the county itself, so that the Guidestones would be publicly owned, even though nobody could say who had commissioned them. The escrow arrangement Martin managed was, by his own description, deliberately layered to obscure where the money originated, funds moving through the bank in a way that let Fendley's company get paid in full without any invoice or record ever pointing back toward a traceable client. Martin confirmed to Fendley only that the funds existed and that the project would be paid for in full, and construction proceeded on that assurance alone. Fendley's company handled the stonework. The finished structure used more than 950 cubic feet of granite, close to 120 tons in total, arranged as 4 massive upright slabs standing over 19 feet tall, a central column the workers called the gnomon stone, and a capstone laid across the top. Each of the 4 main slabs weighed in the range of 42,000 pounds. Cut into the granite were more than 4,000 sandblasted characters, each about 4 inches high, carrying the same set of guiding principles in 8 different languages: English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. The center slab held a shorter capsule of guidance carved into English alone, along with a small time capsule marker beneath it that recorded the date the capsule was buried and the date it was meant to be opened, a date set far in the future. The stones were not simply erected, they were engineered as an instrument. A hole was bored through the capstone and through the center gnomon stone at an angle calibrated so that a beam of sunlight would pass through both openings and strike a marked point at solar noon, allowing anyone standing at the site to check the calendar by watching where the light fell. A second slot was cut through one of the outer stones aligned to track the North Star, as it appears to shift over the centuries due to the wobble of the Earth's axis. A slow celestial drift that requires real astronomical calculation to account for, not guesswork. The 4 outer slabs themselves were positioned to mark the limits of the sun's rising and setting positions across the year, the solstices on one axis and the equinoxes on another. Whoever designed this consulted with people who understood surveying and astronomy at a serious level. This was not a folk art project assembled by an eccentric with a grudge. It was a coordinated engineering effort requiring architects, stonemasons, and at least one person with real technical knowledge of celestial mechanics, all working for a client who was never named and who insisted, in the contract itself, that all working plans be destroyed once construction was finished. Nothing was to remain on paper. The instructions were to live only in the granite. On March 22, 1980, the vernal equinox, several hundred people gathered on that hillside for the public unveiling. Local press covered it. County officials attended. A crowd that had been hearing rumors for months about a mystery monument finally got to see what had been built and what it said. The inscriptions laid out 10 guiding principles, instructions for rebuilding a society after some unspecified catastrophe. They called for holding humanity's population under 500 million people in what the stone called perpetual balance with nature, for guiding reproduction to improve fitness and diversity, for uniting humanity under a new living language, for governing passion, faith, tradition, and all other matters with tempered reason, for protecting people and nations with fair laws and just courts, for resolving disputes in a new outside forum rather than through war, for avoiding petty laws and useless officials, for balancing personal rights with social duties, and for leaving room on earth for nature. A capstone slab above the 4 main stones carried a short mission statement calling the monument Guidestones to an age of reason. Underneath the center stone sat a smaller time capsule, its lid marked with the date it was sealed, and a second date, set far in the future, when it was intended to be opened, a gesture that made explicit what the whole structure already implied. This was built for people who did not yet exist, addressed to a future its authors expected never to see. The philosophical content itself borrowed openly from earlier attempts at universal ethics, echoing language that circulated in mid-century humanist and conservationist writing, the kind of post-war anxiety about nuclear annihilation and unchecked population growth that had shaped serious policy discussion for decades before Christian ever walked into Fendley's office. None of that made the monument less strange. If anything, it sharpened the puzzle, because whoever wrote those 10 principles was clearly literate in that broader intellectual tradition, comfortable enough with its vocabulary to compress it into carved commandments, and wealthy enough to skip the pamphlet entirely and go straight to permanent granite. Visitors soon began calling the site America's Stonehenge, a nickname that stuck for the rest of its existence, and one that fit better than most people realized. Like its English namesake, the Georgia monument functioned as both a solar and lunar calendar, built by people willing to spend enormous resources achieving a precision that served no practical purpose except the purpose itself. Proof that whoever built it took the sky seriously enough to carve their calculations into stone rather than paper. Reaction split immediately, and it never stopped splitting. Some visitors read the inscriptions as an earnest, if grandiose attempt at secular humanist philosophy, a kind of updated 10 Commandments for a nuclear age that genuinely feared its own capacity for self-destruction. Others read the population language, the talk of guided reproduction, and the anonymous funding, and concluded that something else was being described. Over the following decades, the stones became a fixture in discussions of hidden global planning, invoked by radio hosts, self-published authors, and eventually a wide swath of internet commentary that treated the monument as a literal blueprint left behind by an organization that intended to act on it. Christian, through Martin, always maintained the group had no coercive power and no plan to enforce anything. They had simply written down what they believed and paid to have it carved permanently into stone, on the theory that granite outlasts governments. Whether that explanation satisfied anyone was almost beside the point. The stones stood on that hill for 42 years, visited by tourists, defaced periodically by protesters, referenced in books and documentaries, and never once explained by the one man who could have explained them, because Wyatt Martin never spoke his name. The strangeness did not stay confined to the original 1980 dedication. In September of 2008, someone secretly added a new element to the monument itself, fitting a small stone cube bearing carved numbers and letters into a notch at the top of one of the granite slabs. Whoever placed it did so without permission from the county, and it drew attention within days, prompting county officials to have it removed once its unauthorized origin became clear. Nobody was ever identified as the person responsible for adding it, and its exact meaning was never confirmed by anyone connected to the original construction, which meant a monument already wrapped in one unsolved authorship question briefly acquired a second, smaller one, layered directly on top of it. It was a fitting preview of what the site would keep doing for the rest of its existence, attracting mystery the way the granite itself attracted lichen, one layer settling over another, none of it ever fully explained. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. For most of that time, the identity of R.C. Christian was the only real unsolved question attached to the Guidestones. Investigators did try, journalists tried harder. A low-budget documentary titled Dark Clouds Over Elberton, released in 2015, dug into the case and surfaced a name that had circulated in private for years. Herbert Kirsten, an Iowa physician and self-described environmentalist who died in 2005. The film linked Kirsten to an address that Martin was known to have mailed correspondence to, though it stopped well short of definitive proof, and the documentary drew almost no mainstream press coverage at the time. A more recent examination of the case, published by CNN in early 2024, traced a similarly rare book that Christian was reported to have written under his pseudonym in 1986, titled Common Sense Renewed, meant to lay out his broader philosophy. Copies proved difficult to find. One was listed in a university library's catalog in Florida and reportedly disappeared from the collection before it could be examined. Another copy eventually turned up exactly where a careful researcher might expect one to survive, sitting in a back room of the public library in Elberton itself, pulled out for inspection only after a librarian was asked directly whether the library owned it. None of this produced a court-certified answer. What it produced was a pattern, a story that kept almost resolving and then didn't, evidence sitting one room away from where anyone thought to look, names that fit loosely but never conclusively, and a central figure, Martin, who held the one verified fact that could have ended the mystery and chose, deliberately and until his last breath, to let it die with him. Then, on the 6th of July, 2022, the mystery changed shape entirely. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, security cameras positioned at the site recorded a figure approaching the Guidestones on foot, carrying an object. Moments later, an explosion tore through the monument. Elbert County Sheriff's Office personnel, alerted by nearby residents who reported hearing the blast, arrived to find that the detonation had shattered one of the 4 19-foot granite slabs, sending debris across the site. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist, along with a bomb squad, given the possibility that additional explosive material remained on scene. Surveillance footage released by investigators the following day showed the same figure sprinting away from the structure toward a silver, 4-door sedan, which then left the area. No injuries were reported. No arrests were made that day, or in the days that followed. What happened next has its own strange weight to it. The blast had not brought down the entire monument. 4 of the 5 vertical elements, by most surveillance angles, were still standing, though one had been shattered, and the structural integrity of the whole assembly was now in question. GBI agents on site made a call that ended the debate about what would happen to the Guidestones permanently. Investigators determined that the damage had left the remaining stones unstable and unsafe to approach for a proper forensic search, and so, later that same day, a backhoe was brought in, and the entire remaining structure, cracked slabs, center stone, capstone, foundation markers and all, was pulled down and hauled away. A monument that had survived 4 decades of weather, vandalism, ideological argument, and constant tourist traffic, was gone within 24 hours of the detonation, demolished not by the bomb itself, but by the emergency response to it. Whatever forensic value the undamaged stones might have held, whatever trace evidence might have remained on the surfaces the bomber never touched, went into a truck along with the rubble. The GBI's own statement framed the demolition as a safety necessity, not an evidentiary decision, but the practical result was the same either way, whatever the intent behind the call actually was. The physical crime scene, the one piece of the case that could not lie or forget, or change its story, no longer exists in its original form. The investigation that followed produced surveillance video, a description of a silver sedan, and very little else that has ever been made public. GBI agent Jesse Maddox, speaking to reporters on the day of the blast, said investigators did not yet know what type of explosive had been used. Years later, that basic detail has still not been released. In July of 2024, on the 2-year anniversary of the bombing, a Georgia television station contacted the GBI directly for an update and was told there was none. No suspect had been named. No motive had been confirmed. The case file, as far as the public record shows, remains open and largely silent. Lee Vaughn, the Elbert County Commission chairman, told a CNN reporter examining the case in early 2024 that the investigation had lost its momentum. A spokesperson for the GBI declined to release documents connected to the case or make investigators available for interviews when the same reporter asked. The clip of the unidentified person approaching the monument, released to the public within a day of the explosion, notably carried no visible timestamp, and the agency did not explain why when asked. The bombing also pulled the Guidestones into a level of national attention the monument had rarely seen, even at the height of its earlier notoriety. Within days, the story had traveled well past Georgia, picked up by national outlets and, not long after, mocked and dissected on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, whose segment treated the whole affair with the kind of disbelief that had followed the monument for decades, the sense that a roadside curiosity in rural Elbert County had somehow become important enough to bomb. Local officials found themselves fielding calls from reporters they had never spoken to before, trying to explain a case they could not themselves fully explain. Granite quarrying remains one of the top employers in Elbert County, and for a place better known among outsiders for tombstones and building stone than for international headlines, the sudden interest was its own kind of disruption, one more layer of strangeness added to a story that already had plenty. The bombing did not happen in a vacuum, and the surrounding context is itself part of the documented record, whatever its connection to the actual bomber turns out to be. Weeks before the explosion, the Guidestones had become an unlikely flashpoint in Georgia's Republican gubernatorial primary. A candidate named Candace Taylor, running against the sitting governor, had built part of her campaign around the claim that the monument was satanic in nature, referring to it publicly as Satan's Guidestones, and pledging that if elected she would see it torn down. Taylor placed third in the May 24th primary, receiving roughly 3% of the vote, well short of any position to act on that pledge through official means. When the explosion occurred just over a month later, her name resurfaced immediately in public speculation, given how directly her platform had aligned with the outcome. Taylor herself posted publicly after the blast, framing it in religious terms, writing that God could do anything he wanted, including striking down what she called satanic guidestones. She has not been named by investigators as a suspect, and no evidence tying her directly to the bombing has been made public. What is on the record is a stranger coda to her involvement in the story. 5 days after the explosion, on July 11, 2022, sheriff's deputies in Baxley, Georgia, roughly 200 miles from Elberton, responded to Taylor's home after a call came in describing a shooting and a woman threatening to kill herself. Officers arrived to find no one had been shot and no crime had occurred at all. The call was a hoax, a swatting incident directed at a woman whose name had become entangled with the bombing purely through her campaign rhetoric weeks earlier. The case around that call was referred separately for investigation. It stands as its own strange footnote, evidence of how quickly and how dangerously the Guidestones case metastasized beyond the physical crime itself, drawing in people who had no proven connection to what happened on that hillside at 4 a.m. Consider what the case actually contains, set out plainly, without embellishment. A monument was commissioned anonymously in 1979 by a man whose real name only one other person ever learned, and that person guarded it until his death in 2021, keeping a promise that outlived 4 decades of public curiosity, journalistic digging, and a fair amount of internet obsession. The monument itself was destroyed 42 years later by a person or persons unknown, captured on camera but never identified, in an act investigators have never explained in terms of motive, method, or suspect. The remaining physical structure, which might have carried forensic evidence, was demolished by the responding agency itself within hours, for reasons of public safety that were reasonable on their face, but that also happened to erase the crime scene before a full search could be conducted on the original stones. 2 years after the bombing, the state's own investigators had nothing new to report. As of this telling, that remains the case. Not a single name has been confirmed publicly, neither for who built the Guidestones, nor for who destroyed them. It would be simple to reach for the word conspiracy here, and simpler still to lean on the word theory, but neither one is necessary, and neither one is accurate. What actually happened requires no invention. A wealthy anonymous group spent real money, through a real bank, using a real granite company, to build a real structure that stood in a Georgia field for 42 years, aligned to real astronomical events, carrying a real philosophical message that a real portion of the public came to see as sinister. A real person destroyed it with a real explosive device, walked to a real car, and drove away, and has never been caught. These are not competing narratives requiring a choice between belief and skepticism. They are facts, sitting next to each other, refusing to resolve into a tidy conclusion, which is precisely what makes the case difficult to let go of. Most unsolved mysteries eventually acquire an official explanation that most people accept, even if a small number continue to argue. The Guidestones case has produced no such settling. Nobody in a position of authority has ever confirmed who Christian was. Nobody in a position of authority has ever named who bombed the monument. Both silences are total, and both have lasted for years, one for over 4 decades and the other for more than 2 years and still running. Think about what it actually takes to keep a secret of this kind intact for as long as this one held. Wyatt Martin was a small-town bank president, a man who saw the same neighbors at church and at the grocery store for his entire life, a man who was asked about R.C. Christian's real identity more times than he could likely count, by journalists, by curious tourists, by his own friends. Every single time, by every account that survives, he declined. Not once did a slip get reported. Not once did a name leak out of that bank in a way that could be verified. That is not the ordinary behavior of a man protecting a mildly interesting secret. That is the behavior of someone who understood exactly what he had promised, and who treated the promise as something closer to a sacred obligation than a business courtesy. Whatever Christian was to Martin, client, friend, or something else entirely, the loyalty ran in one direction only, all the way to the end. What remains today, on that hillside 7 miles north of Elberton, is close to nothing. The granite is gone, trucked away in the hours after the blast. The 5-acre plot, still owned by Elbert County exactly as Christian and Martin arranged it in 1979, sits largely empty now, a patch of ground that once held the only instrument of its kind in the country, a monument built to survive the end of civilization, and instead unable to survive 4 decades of ordinary human history. What does survive is the paperwork, scattered but real, escrow records that once ran through the Granite City Bank, a construction contract with the Elberton Granite Finishing Company that specified, in writing, that its own working plans be destroyed once the stones were finished, an instruction dutifully followed so that even the blueprints Christian approved no longer exist anywhere. A rare, self-published book that keeps resurfacing in library catalogues, just often enough to prove it is real, and disappearing from shelves just often enough to keep anyone from reading it start to finish. Surveillance footage of an unidentified figure and a silver sedan, time-stamped everywhere except, oddly, on the one clip the public actually saw. A GBI file that a county commission chairman himself has publicly described as having lost momentum. Joe Fendley, the Granite Company president, who took the very first meeting with the stranger who called himself Christian, died years before the bombing and never learned who his client truly was. Wyatt Martin, the only man alive who held that answer, carried it to his own grave in 2021, less than a year before someone destroyed the thing that answer had made possible. Between those 2 deaths sits the entire unresolved history of the Georgia Guidestones, a monument commissioned in total secrecy, built in full public view, worshipped by some and feared by others, and finally erased in the dark by a person who has never been named, in a case the state's own investigators admit, on the record, has gone quiet. Visitors still occasionally drive out along the highway to the empty 5-acre plot, drawn by curiosity or nostalgia, and find nothing there but grass, a historical marker, and the faint outline where the foundation once sat. Some leave notes. Some just stand there a while, looking at flat ground where something enormous used to be, trying to square the emptiness with the photographs they had seen online. The stones were built to instruct whoever might read them after some future catastrophe reduced the world to its foundations. Instead, the catastrophe that ended them was smaller, faster, and entirely of human origin, and even now, with the granite gone and the field empty, nobody officially knows who lit the fuse, exactly as nobody ever officially learned who ordered the stones raised in the first place. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.